Chesapeake Bay has long been considered one of America's most important natural resources. The bay has provided shelter, income, and food for generations of Americans. Over many years, however, life on and around the bay has grown crowded and more complex. Chemical runoff from factories and farms, and other contaminants in water drainage, all have a way of polluting the waters of our bay. This has left the bay in peril and in need of immediate action. As oysters feed on plankton and other particles, they remove suspended sediments and chemical contaminants, keeping the bay clean. But the oyster is in serious decline.
The goal for the Chesapeake Bay is to have a self-sustaining oyster population. So an oyster is a mollusk, and the type of oyster in the Chesapeake Bay is the eastern oyster. And it is one of the cornerstone species of the Chesapeake Bay, along with rockfish, blue crab. Bottom of the bay on hard substrate. It feeds it's a filter feeder. So it filters the water through its gills, and then the particulates, which sediment, heavy metals, nutrients, all gets particulated in the gills and then goes through the digestive tract, sequestered by the oyster, and that's just the process of how they filter feed. So they're just filtering the water through their body, collecting all the impurities, and then they excrete clean water out, and one oyster is said to be able to filter 50 gallons of water per day.
Statistics you hear are, and again, these are all based on wild, numbers and assumptions, but the estimates are that the number, based on observations from, Captain John Smith and the early settlers, and counts that the number of oysters in the bay at European settlement would have filtered the entire bay water in a day, right? The number now is like 2 years or something, right? That's how much we've decimated the oyster population. So you can, that would be like me cutting out your 2 kidneys and leaving you with, a kidney the size of the tip of your pinky. That's basically what you're talking about. We've done a good start in terms of cleaning up our own fertilizer, which is human poop. The flush tax did a lot towards improving. So we need people to stop sprawling out of the cities and actually moving back into the cities so they can take advantage of all the money that's gone into the waste management in the cities. And then so stop urban sprawl is probably number 1, and then that's number 2. Number 1 is actually to get a handle on agricultural pollution, because they've been virtually unregulated, because they can always wave the flag of, we're feeding the population, so hands off us. But they've been guilty of some really poor management practices, and their fields are saturated with phosphorus, and yet they're still dumping more manure on them, so that stuff's just running right off into the bay. So about 50% of the fertilizer going into the bay now is from agriculture, and the other stuff's been pretty much, stormwater is the other big one that needs to get at, because that's basically unregulated now. So the stormwater that you may have heard of, the rain tax, which people object to, but that's really an important thing, is that any animal feces or any oil from an oil change in somebody's yard, that's all running straight into the bay now, because there's no management of that anywhere.
The main way oysters are harvested is through dredging, and this is a simple technique where a pronged basket is lowered from the back of a boat and dragged along the bottom. And so the oysters, they live on hard substrate, which is typically themselves. So the oysters live on top of the oysters. They keep growing on top of each other's shell. And the dredge, the prongs, dig into the substrate, dig into the oysters, and rip them up. And it loosens up the hard substrate. It dislodges the oysters, because that's what they want to harvest. So it's picking up the oysters. It's creating crevices and depleting the hard substrate available for new oysters to grow on. Aquaculture is the farming and propagation of plants and animals, and in this case, oyster farming, oyster propagation, mussels, shellfish. It can be done to any plants or animals. There's 2 types of aquaculture, there's taking, breeding, harvesting, and then selling to markets for consumption. And there's also stock enhancement, where the same process as the consumption, but in this case they're harvested and then put out into the wild to restore and enhance the wild populations.
Start off life is like little zooplankton, right? So how those are cultured are in laboratories. First, get them to either put them in a bag with mesh, or get them to hang on these strings. Or they look like a baby oyster, but they're probably about the size of your pinky nail or something. That's called a spat, right? And so up until that stage, they're reared inside in laboratories where they're basically growing really nice algae with no other pollutants or anything, so they grow really well. They're just growing pure algae cultures, and they're feeding them to these to the zooplankton form. But as soon as they turn into that like baby oyster form, then they can send them out to the aquaculture operations, and then they put them in there's different things. They put them in bags, or they hang them on ropes, and they get bigger as they just dump them out of the bags into this thing and clean them off on. They have like a big it's like a big washing machine that they clean them up in, and then they put them back into fresh clean bags and throw them back out there.
So the benefits of aquaculture are that it'll lessen the burden on wild populations. It adds jobs to the market because you're making farms. You have to have people work the farms, and the main is that it lets the wild population grow.
What they're doing is they're filtering the algae out of the water, right? And that algae is getting its energy and building itself from sunlight. And so they're basically taking that fertilizer that we're putting too much of into the water right now, and they're taking that fertilizer out in the form of algae and turning it into oyster. So you're basically, solving two problems with one thing. And the only downside is the space that they take up. You got to have places for your oyster cages or your oyster racks, and so there potential navigation hazards, and a lot of it's just resistance to change. The future is, if you go around different parts of the world where they've done shellfish harvesting, there's not that much shellfish harvesting going on anymore. Most people are farming it, and that's the thing, is that because of the traditional way of life and the mystery and the romanticism surrounding the skipjacks and the oyster tongers, they've been really resistant to go to aquaculture here. But you can go to the lagoons in southern France where they're growing oysters, and they've got them on ropes hanging down, and these big, it takes up some of the water, and you have to know where they are, and you can see them, so you steer around them, and you might hit them at night if you're riding your boat at night. So there are some downsides to them, but the water's crystal clear, and yet these lagoons are all surrounded by cities and stuff, just like the bay is. And if they were to practice extensive aquaculture, those oysters are going to do the same amount of filtering as if they were on the bottom in the natural reefs. And even the ideal scenario would be that the aquaculture is so successful that you can leave the natural ones unexploited, and then they can use evolution and phenotypic plasticity to fight off the parasites.
A couple things against aquaculture. Mainly, it's taking away jobs from the watermen. So all the watermen that grew up on the bay getting fish, oysters, crab, now they don't have any jobs because everyone's doing the oyster farming. So you have programs through like the Maryland Sea Grant where they give free classes to watermen to teach them how to perform aquaculture, to give them a leg up, so you don't have just entrepreneurs coming in to do the farming. You have the watermen who grew up loving oysters and living off the oysters, and it gives them a chance to get their foot in the door even though they don't have any experience.